muted group theory come into play? You're a communications professional. You're in HR department. You're a PR person. Where might this be a relevant issue? And I'd like to broaden it out beyond feminism. I think there are many groups that are muted.
Could it just be like, it's like a woman working with mostly men?
Okay.
And like, you know what I mean?
Okay, so if you have that kind of a situation, what you would want the men to become aware of the fact that there's a handicap, in a sense, of language here,
Yeah.
that they need to work with. Okay, that they need to. I'm thinking in terms of PR. If you're doing PR with a group of people and you keep using whatever language you've got towards that group, and it just doesn't hit their experience, you may just not have the right language available to you to hit their experience. So you may need to create new words, you may need to create new phrases, new ways of thinking about things to reach that group.
You're saying you could expand further than male-female?
Yes. I mean, she doesn't do it. Kramer A doesn't extend this beyond male and female. But the question becomes, any group that is a marginal group that the language that's available is inadequate for voicing their experience. So there could be any number of groups that don't have words available to express their experience.
Like before sexual harassment was actually the term
Yes.
in the workplace, that would be like a muted group, and women wouldn't be able to explain exactly what happened to them.
Right, because we didn't have a language for it.
Right.
And once we got a language for it, we built a whole system around it.
Right.
Child abuse is the same way. So in that sense, children were muted. The children were mistreated regularly, but there was no term called child abuse that named it. And now all of a sudden we have a name, and now all of a sudden we have a whole system built around it. So once you name something, give it a language, you can then begin. And that's the way we work. We build around language and terms. All right, so we're into speech code theory today. We got two new theories that we're doing: speech codes and cultural studies. Montclair State University has a speech code. Do you know that? You know there are things you're allowed to say here and things you're not allowed to say here?
No.
You know this is 10 pages long in small print? Have you read it? Well, you do. You have a speech code in this place. I'll read it to you. It says this. Here's part of it. Montclair State University is committed to equal student access to all campus benefits and services without regard to gender, race, color, national origin, disabling condition, or sexual orientation. In order to foster an atmosphere of respect, understanding, and goodwill among all members of our diverse campus community, the university will regard differences of religion, race, ethnicity, gender, age, disability, and sexual orientation as strengths to be honored, not mocked or derided. Thus, the university expects all members of the community to behave in ways that enhance our multi-ethnic and multicultural society. So at Montclair State University, you are in a speech community that has certain rules about who you can talk to in what way about what things. And there are types of speech that are forbidden to you. And there are speech behaviors that if you engage in them, you will end up being thrown out of the community or brought before a student hearing board or something like this.
There was actually an article about that in Montclair about some racial slurs.
Some racial?
Said if the diner, I didn't read the whole article.
Yeah, the diner, terroristic language, right. The fellow was sitting there voicing threats. You know this story?
No.
Yeah. The fellow was sitting in the diner one night, late at night, voicing threats against various genders and ethnicities and things. And And then he left, and somebody called campus police and said, I was afraid. I felt threatened by this. And so they finally found the person. Yeah. And
He wasn't a student. He was-
Oh, yeah, he was a student, right?
no, it was not a student. No. So, but right. So communities have certain ways in which they speak to and with each other. And so I don't know how you feel about the fact that the university has a speech code to it. But speech codes deal with these things. So let's first get the idea of a speech code in place.
The speech code goes to all of these jobs.
What's that?
Jobs.
At work. Yes. So the idea of a speech code has to do with, and one of the ways you can think about this is with the 6 kind of journalist questions. The who, what, where, when, why, how. So that's 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So one of the things you can think about in a speech code, if you're in any place where there are limits or channels about who you can speak to, what you can say to them, where you say it, how you say it, what you're trying to accomplish by that, any place where that's true, you are engaged in a speech code setting. You're engaged in a place where there has been formed a structure of rules. Now sometimes these rules are created deliberately, as in the case of university speech codes, where we create them explicitly. So these can be explicitly created, or they can be implicit. So for instance, it's highly unlikely that in your family, in your home, you've ever sat down and said, let's create a set of rules about how we speak to each other here in this house. I don't know, if you've had if your parents are both university professors, you might do that. I don't know.
My mom does.
What's that?
My mom does.
It's just because she's a teacher, though.
Yeah, she's a teacher, right? So she says, we're going to make explicit rules about what goes on around here and how we talk to each other and when we talk to each other, what we talk about and how we talk to each other. But you're in a lot of situations where these rules are not written down. You have to discover them as you enter these different communities, these different groups that you're in. And so, for instance, you brought up the issue of work, right? That work has, different places has a code of speech. There's certain language that's acceptable, certain language that's not acceptable, ways you talk to people, people you talk to, people you don't talk to, when you talk, when you don't talk. And so there are all of these rules. Where's another place? So we have work, we have family. Okay, classrooms, school.
Church.
Okay, in your church.
AA.
Okay, yeah, and support groups. That's a good example. Support groups have a very rigid speech code about who can say what, to whom, what way, for what purposes. Right.
At parties or at clubs.
Okay, parties, clubs.
But I mean, for like parties, clubs, there's, like Montclair State has a written speech code. Does that really apply? Or from that?
Probably not.
Church doesn't really apply? Or family even?
Well, it depends where you get. Again,
Whereas like work or school, like you could be in trouble for it.
yeah. I don't know. It's an interesting question about the intrusion of the public into the private. You know, when are you on private communication code ground, and when are you on public communication code ground? It's, I think that your realm of private communication code is shrinking a great deal. For instance, you can read on this university, it's actually the Student Code of Conduct, the Montclair State University Student Code of Conduct. It's like 10 pages, 12-page PDF you can read. They tell you that in your social networking sites, that they recommend to you that you are very careful about what you place on those social networking sites, because they tell you that students have been denied employment or relieved of employment at the university because of things posted on their social network sites. So in that case, your social network site, there's a kind of a speech code that feels right for blogs and for the internet and for stuff. But the university is telling you that you might want to consider that there are other speech codes in effect that are going to have an effect on your employment or at the university. So that's a question of boundaries that becomes very significant for you in thinking about speech codes. Now, in your book, Jerry Philipson is the person who brings this theory into communication studies. All right, and he did his first work among a group of people in South Chicago. Now, is anybody here from South Chicago? Anybody know that area? All right, well, he called it Teamsterville. Now, what was that about? What was going on that he gives it this name? What's that? Unions. Well, okay, most of the people in this community, South Chicago, were truck drivers. There were people who were union folks.
In that town, they didn't necessarily like outsiders. It was like they were a team and they stuck around each other. They didn't want other people coming in and not knowing their ways of working.
Okay, but Teamster is a union term. So I think that we need to clue that in. That the Teamsters is a union, a labor union, and so I think but it was a closed kind of community. You know, it's very much about who's your relatives and who do we know your family, right? It's very kind of a closed community. Now they had rules about who could talk to who about what, when, why, and how. Now I thought there were some interesting ones. Do you remember any of the interesting rules from the Teamsterville case? Yes.
He thought that because he had used language to try to discipline younger kids.
Okay.
Younger kids were like, you use the physical violence or showing like if you're older, you need to show them.
Okay.
Fight for them.
So in a situation where he as a male was a social worker in that area, he tried to speak to people about their behaviors. And that was interpreted by them as weakness. That you don't talk about correcting people's behaviors, you use force in order to deal with it. So they were not, when those people were using force instead of force versus talk, is this a individual psychological problem? Well,
That's the way that you were.
go ahead. Okay, if this is the way you're brought up, and if these are the speech codes for your culture, for your small culture, your co-culture, or however you want to call it, co-culture, So there's a co-culture there that says you don't use language to solve problems with certain people. You use force to do it. It's not an individual psychological problem at that point. It's a cultural problem. So this is part of what communication theory asks, is when we see behaviors like this is perfectly normal within the speech codes of this particular group of people. And there were things that were counted as insults in that community that would not be counted as insults in another community. So who you could talk to about what counted as an insult, what didn't count as an insult. This is not universal. This is cultural. And so Jerry Philipson wants people who study communication to be very alert to the issue of the speech codes that are operating within the cultures that they deal with. Right? So let's ask you the question. Have you ever been a time when you've gone to some place, you went to an internship, you went to a summer job, you went to some place, and you tried to communicate in a certain way, and you rapidly learned, no, that's not how we do it around here. That there are different rules about who you can talk to about what, and for what purposes. Anybody have any encounters with that?
Sounds like perfect scenario for a jail, right?
What's that?
Who you can talk to,
Yeah, okay.
what and when.
Yeah, for a prison, right.
Right?
Yeah. A prison setting would be a place where there's a particular speech code that is strongly enforced about who you can talk to, who you should not talk to about what. No one's got examples.
Working from a small company to a larger company.
Okay, in a small company, the speech codes.
You would even maybe just go to the whoever owns the business, but going to a larger company, you would go to your manager and not the guy.
Okay, right. So you're not there's stricter rules about who you can go see, what you can talk about in the middle of those settings. All right. So Jerry Philipson did this, and now this is a speech communication theory that is developed by a certain methodology. If you've taken your comm research classes, this makes sense to you, that this is not an empirical theory. This is not a theory built on quantitative research. This is a theory built on qualitative research. And it's done using a particular form of research called ethnography. Right? So this is an ethnographic theory. Ethnographic. Theory. So some theories that we'll encounter as we go through this are developed by doing research based on surveys and statistical analysis of results. So we go around and ask you questions, we tally the results, we calculate things. This is built by people going and listening to a community, living in a community for an extended period of time, and then writing up their notes and doing analysis of their notes. So in ethnography, what you do, there's a couple different ways to do it. Who's taken research methods yet? We've taken ethnography. All right, yes, I think we did that, right? All right. So there's a couple ways you can be involved in doing an ethnography. Who remembers what they are? Do you remember? Yeah.
You can put yourself in that environment. It was participant observers, where you're participating in the interactions of the research.
Okay, so a participant observer goes into this as a person who will live in Teamsterville and go to the corner tavern with Teamsterville people, but they know that you're doing research. Okay.
And then observer participant,
Okay, then an observer.
you go into it and they don't know, people that you're observing don't know that you're really observing
Right.
them.
So you go into it, but you don't tell them you're a researcher doing research. But you're taking field notes, you're taking, gathering information, you're writing down things. Maybe you have tape recordings going. There are a lot of ethical issues in that. And then there are people who are complete participants. So this is where you actually get involved. You get a job there. You start to live in exactly the same way. You're not just among them, but you're doing the things that they do. So there are a lot of people, for instance, Griffin talks about, my brain stopped. The fellow, Dwight Conquergood, who does gang research in Chicago. Now, Dwight Conquergood lives in the developments where the gangs are. He hangs out on the streets with the gangs. They know that he is a researcher, but he builds trust over time and interviews them about their language, about their rules, about who talks to who, you know, what counts as an insult, what counts as what do you say if someone says this to you. He does that kind of research. But he's not a complete participant because he doesn't go out in gang activity. But some people get involved in ethnographies where they go right into it and they become part of the group in order to experience it, as well to write about it. So in that sense, Jerry Philipson's communication research work is different from a lot of other communication research work because it's built on an ethnographic approach to doing communication studies. You write field notes, so that you get extensive page after page of observations about people. You look for patterns, and then you put these into propositions. You say, I saw 4 things about the communication that goes on. So for instance, there was a research project down in Texas for Mexican-American teenagers, teenage girls. And they wanted to know, how do they use media to manage their dual national identity? So the person who did the research got to know them, worked in a day center with these girls, talked to them over time, listened to them talk to each other about the shows that they watched, wrote all that down, and then did an analysis of it and said this is how they use that media to talk about their identities, to talk about communication. So ethnography is a different way of going out about this kind of research. Now, there was another culture that they reported on. Let's see where we're at. There's another culture they reported on besides Teamsterville that they researched. What was the other culture that they looked at? You remember? Right. Now, who knows the trick to this? Right?
I had a question.
Go ahead. Yeah.
They're saying that all Americans are part of this culture, yet wouldn't the Teamsters be part of the culture too?
Right.
So we're all part of it at a basic level, but then we break them into other smaller?
Well, he wanted to point out that this group of people that he met mostly in California and then by watching the media. So these were people in his experience doing ethnography again. So these are people he came into contact with who had a certain way of talking about things that was very different from the Teamsterville
Communication majors.
code. Yeah.
Would we fall into that?
We are probably in the Nasarima in Philipson's Nasarima communication culture, where we believe, like for instance, if you sit a Teamsterville person down and say to them, look, you and I are having a conflict, let's sit down and have a dialogue about this, where I'm going to understand your perspective and you're going to understand my perspective, and we're going to broaden our horizons and come to new understandings. That's not going to work in Teamsterville culture, you know, because that's not part of the speech code. That's not part of the way in which they conceive of communication situations. Now, the Nasarima communication what were some of the qualities of it? Or something different from Teamsterville culture?
Individualistic.
Okay. So they valued the individual more. So in a Teamsterville culture, if we're at dinner in a Teamsterville home, I don't want the kids, I'm not interested in anything the kids have to say. You know, I don't want to hear from them. I don't care what they think about something. That's just not part of my thing. In a Nasarima dinner table, the families are talking with each other, they're asking what's going on, they're listening to each other. So they value the individual versus the Teamsterville values the role and the status more. So you have more value on the individual. Who talks to who in what ways about what things. Right? In the Nasarima culture, every individual is valued highly for their insights, what they can bring to the situation. In Teamsterville, what matters is whose group you're in, what position you have, what job you have, what family you came from. It's a very different kind of a setting. Now, support groups are like this. I don't know if you've ever worked with support groups or if you've ever done any research about support groups. AA, NA, OA, all the different, what's that? Yeah, Alcoholics Anonymous, whatever. All of these support groups have a very particular structure of speech codes. For instance, in the support group structure, it is forbidden for people to solve each other's problems. So if I go to a support group and I say, I'm having a problem with, my child or something, it is not part of support group networks for me to say, oh, let me explain to you what you need to do to solve that. That's a kind of behavior that is ruled out in a support group structure. What they do is they spend time listening and drawing out and then applying some of the 12-step principles or whatever it is that they're working with in there. But it's not, if somebody starts solving other people's problems, that's outside of the speech code. That's part of that setting. Now let me tell you where I saw this yesterday in the news. With this Gina 6 group, there was a television show that got the parents on one end of a video conference of the white fellow who got beat up, and they got the parents of the African American fellows who were accused of doing the beating on the other end of a video conference. And they put these people on national television and tried to get them to talk with each other. How do you think that went?
Disastrous.
Okay. Now let's ask the question first. Who are these people who put people in that situation, and what are their speech codes?
Just looking for a good story.
Entertainment.
Okay. Are they looking for a good story? Are we using these people for our own purposes? to get ratings, or, I mean, in their world, they think that here's how communication should work. People should talk to each other and work out their problems by understanding each other. So if we bring people together, they will talk about their problems, they will listen to each other, and they will then get together. And the end of the show was saying that this will be fixed when we no longer have the Gina 6, but we have the Gina 7, where they all stand together and march down the street in Louisiana saying that there are, you know, we're all one, we're not all these different racial groups.